October 20th, 1944. Leyte Gulf. The landing craft had already touched shore. The firing had not stopped. Japanese small arms were still active along the treeline. American units were still clearing defensive positions inland. Offshore, naval commanders were adjusting fire missions in real time, reacting to threats that had not yet been fully identified. At that moment, Douglas MacArthur left his craft and stepped into the water. He did not wait for confirmation that the beach was secure. He did not request a cleared perimeter. He did not consult the landing force commander. Instead, he advanced deliberately toward the shore, moving slowly, upright, exposed, with a dozen photographers positioned to capture every step. This was not an impulsive act. It was not confusion. It was not bravado in the heat of battle. It was a decision. MacArthur was the supreme commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific. His responsibility at that moment was continuity of command. His presence was not required on the beach. Doctrine placed senior commanders behind the line, protected, informed, capable of issuing orders without becoming a liability. None of that applied here. What mattered was visibility. He had promised, 2 years earlier, as he withdrew from the Philippines under orders, that he would return. That promise had become public property. It had followed him through Australia, through New Guinea, through every communique and interview. Now he intended to fulfill it not as a military maneuver, but as an image. The cameras were not incidental. They were the point. His staff understood the risk immediately. Naval officers offshore were forced to redirect protection to cover a general who had placed himself inside an active combat zone without coordination. Ground units were compelled to extend security outward to protect a symbolic figure rather than consolidate tactically essential ground. None of this altered the outcome of the landing. It altered the priorities. In Washington, this moment would be understood exactly as intended. The photographs would appear on front pages within 48 hours. The narrative would not be about fire control or beach clearance or Japanese resistance. It would be about return. About promise fulfilled, about inevitability. Franklin Roosevelt already knew the implications. MacArthur's popularity had grown beyond military evaluation. Republicans spoke of him as a future candidate. Conservative newspapers treated him as indispensable. Any attempt to discipline him would not remain internal. It would become political. Standing in the surf at Leyte, MacArthur acted on a settled conclusion. He believed he was insulated. Not by orders, not by protocol, by his own legend. This was the decision. To treat the war not only as a campaign, but as a stage. To accept operational risk in exchange for narrative control. And to assert, without saying it aloud, that no institution present could stop him. At the moment MacArthur stepped into the water at Leyte, the military situation was neither chaotic nor desperate. It was controlled, incomplete, and predictable in the way amphibious operations always were. The opportunity available to Allied forces that morning was defined by time, distance, and command discipline, not by spectacle. The landing plan did not require the Supreme Commander's presence ashore. The operation was already unfolding according to schedule. Assault units had secured initial footholds. Naval gunfire and air support were available on call. Command relationships were established, and subordinate commanders had authority to adjust to resistance as it developed. From a purely military standpoint, the optimal posture for MacArthur was offshore or at a secured command post, where he could observe, receive reports, and intervene only if necessary. Standard doctrine was explicit on this point. Senior commanders were assets whose survival mattered more than their visibility. Their role was to preserve continuity, ensure coordination between land, sea, and air components, and manage the campaign beyond the first hours of contact. No tactical advantage was gained by exposing the theater commander to small arms fire. Intelligence available that morning reinforced this logic. Japanese resistance in the Leyte area was known to be fragmented but not eliminated. Snipers and bypassed defensive positions were expected. Terrain favored concealment. The landing beaches, while suitable, were not yet fully secured. The threat was not hypothetical. It was routine. That routine was precisely why high-value personnel were kept out of the initial phase. Within those constraints, the opportunity was substantial. Allied forces possessed overwhelming naval and air superiority. Japanese supply lines were degraded. Reinforcements could be interdicted. The landing force had sufficient strength to expand the beachhead methodically, reduce resistance inland, and establish secure logistics without urgency or improvisation. Command effectiveness depended on minimizing disruption. Every unplanned movement of senior leadership imposed friction. Escorts had to be reassigned. Communications were strained. Fire support priorities shifted. None of this was catastrophic, but all of it was unnecessary. The opportunity was to proceed deliberately, absorbing Japanese resistance at minimal cost while preserving command stability. MacArthur had alternatives fully aligned with military logic. He could have remained offshore during the critical early hours, receiving briefings and issuing guidance without becoming a focal point. He could have landed later, once the perimeter was secure, accomplishing the same symbolic act without introducing risk. He could have conducted inspections away from the camera judgment of history, reinforcing morale among troops without demanding protection during an active engagement. Even if personal presence was deemed valuable, it could have been controlled. Timing was the variable. Minutes or hours would not have altered the campaign. The Japanese were not in a position to reverse the landing. The opportunity lay in patience, not urgency. What made the opportunity real was not enemy weakness alone. It was Allied dominance combined with procedural discipline. Amphibious warfare rewarded coordination, not drama. The plan already accounted for resistance. The system was functioning as designed. By stepping ashore early, MacArthur converted a stable operational environment into a managed risk. He did not improve the landing's prospects. He did not accelerate success. He simply introduced a failure point where none was required. The opportunity that existed that morning was to let the operation speak for itself, to allow subordinate commanders to execute without distortion, to keep the highest level of command insulated from unnecessary exposure. Nothing in the military situation demanded otherwise. The decision to override that opportunity was not driven by necessity. It was driven by preference. MacArthur did not arrive at Leyte unprepared, nor was his conduct the product of sudden impulse. What appeared reckless in execution was grounded in years of calculation. Long before the landing craft reached the beach, he had already assessed the environment in which he operated and adjusted his behavior accordingly. His central assessment was not about Japanese capabilities. It was about American constraints. Since 1942, MacArthur had observed the limits of institutional authority over him. He had withdrawn from the Philippines under direct presidential order and emerged from that retreat more powerful, not less. His escape to Australia had been reframed as destiny. His promise to return had been amplified into national doctrine by the press. Every attempt by the Joint Chiefs to manage him had stopped short of enforcement. Each confrontation ended the same way: private frustration in Washington, public silence everywhere else. From this pattern, MacArthur drew a clear conclusion. The normal boundaries of command discipline did not apply to him. Not because he was indispensable militarily, but because he was unmanageable politically. He prepared accordingly. His warnings were not issued through memoranda or formal objections. They were embedded in behavior. He tested the system repeatedly. He exceeded authority. He challenged strategic priorities. He leaked selectively. Each time, the response was the same. He was criticized behind closed doors and tolerated in public. Admiral Ernest King recommended dismissal more than once. Nothing happened. General George Marshall attempted restraint through diplomacy. Nothing changed. President Roosevelt complained to aides and staff. No order followed. MacArthur learned faster than his superiors were willing to admit. By the time plans for the Philippine return were finalized, he understood that his greatest operational protection was not armor or distance, but public expectation. If he fulfilled the image Americans believed in, the system would adapt around him. If he defied that image, the system would hesitate. His preparations reflected this understanding. The landing was not just planned militarily. It was choreographed symbolically. Photographers were present not as observers, but as participants. Timing was coordinated with press transmission windows. Language was prepared in advance. The phrase, "I have returned," was not improvised. It was deployed. This was not vanity masquerading as leadership. It was an assessment of power. MacArthur understood that visibility created leverage, and leverage created immunity. The more publicly he embodied the war in the Pacific, the harder it became for anyone to restrain him without appearing to undermine the war itself. His staff had seen this pattern before. They understood the risks. They also understood that objections were futile. The warnings they might have raised were the same warnings already ignored for years. The system had trained them not to intervene. Even his critics had inadvertently reinforced his confidence. Every unpunished infraction confirmed his belief that restraint would never come from above. Every accommodation by Washington strengthened his expectation that the burden of adjustment belonged to others. In this environment, Leyte was not an anomaly. It was a culmination. MacArthur had prepared for this moment not by refining operational safety, but by refining political insulation. He had ensured that the landing would be remembered not as a tactical phase, but as a fulfillment of narrative. That narrative had been cultivated patiently, reinforced consistently, and protected aggressively. When he stepped onto the beach, he was acting within a framework he had already tested and validated. He believed the risks were acceptable because the consequences were predictable. Any danger would be absorbed by subordinates. Any criticism would be muted by popularity. Any anger in Washington would remain private. The warning embedded in his preparation was not directed outward. It was internal. He had convinced himself that nothing meaningful could be done to stop him. Not then. Not later. By 1944, this belief was no longer speculative. It was supported by evidence. Every previous confrontation had ended in his favor. Every boundary had dissolved on contact with public opinion. Leyte was simply the moment he stopped pretending otherwise. The restraint on MacArthur did not fail because of a single decision. It failed because the system around him was structurally incapable of enforcing limits once politics entered the equation. By late 1944, that failure was complete. In Washington, MacArthur was no longer evaluated solely as a commander. He had become a political variable. Every discussion of his conduct began with the same calculation. What would happen if he were confronted publicly? The answer was always the same. The cost would exceed the benefit. Franklin Roosevelt understood this clearly. He had managed generals, admirals, governors, senators, and foreign leaders. He knew when authority could be exercised and when it had to be deferred. With MacArthur, authority stopped at the edge of public opinion. The general's popularity was not abstract. Conservative newspapers praised him relentlessly. Republican figures spoke openly about him as a future presidential candidate. Any visible reprimand would not remain a military matter. It would become a domestic political crisis in the middle of a global war. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were trapped inside that reality. Admiral Ernest King had no illusions about MacArthur. He regarded him as insubordinate, self-promoting, and strategically disruptive. King argued for removal. He did not disguise his contempt. But King was a naval officer operating inside a civilian-controlled system that prioritized political cohesion over internal discipline. His recommendations were heard. They were not acted upon. General George Marshall took a different approach, but arrived at the same impasse. Marshall believed in institutional order. He believed in quiet management, in persuasion, in containment rather than confrontation. With MacArthur, those tools achieved nothing lasting. Each accommodation only reinforced the general's autonomy. Each attempt at restraint stopped short of enforcement because enforcement required presidential willingness to absorb political fallout. That willingness never materialized. Roosevelt's calculus was consistent. The war effort depended on public confidence. MacArthur was part of that confidence whether the administration liked it or not. To challenge him openly risked appearing divided, vindictive, or weak. To tolerate him was distasteful, but manageable. Roosevelt chose management over discipline every time. This choice became precedent. Once it was clear that MacArthur could not be publicly corrected, every institution beneath the presidency adjusted. Naval commanders adapted operational plans to his demands. Army staff absorbed his deviations. Strategic disagreements were softened, delayed, or reframed to avoid confrontation. The system learned to bend rather than break. The effect was cumulative. MacArthur's defiance no longer triggered resistance. It triggered accommodation. His public gestures were not countered because countering them required a unified institutional response that no one was willing to lead. Each actor waited for someone else to bear the cost. Congress played its role as well. MacArthur cultivated relationships carefully. He communicated with sympathetic legislators. He framed strategic disagreements as questions of national, rather than military judgment. This further raised the stakes of restraint. Any move against him could be portrayed as political sabotage rather than professional correction. By 1944, the overrule was no longer a single intervention. It was a condition. Military logic existed, but it operated inside boundaries drawn by political fear. The chain of command remained intact on paper, but its upper links were constrained by considerations unrelated to operations. MacArthur did not need explicit permission to act, as he did at Leyte. He already knew how the system would respond. Privately, there would be irritation. Memoranda would be written. Conversations would be held behind closed doors. Publicly, nothing would happen. The institutional mechanisms designed to control senior commanders had been neutralized by the requirement to preserve unity, morale, and electoral stability. No individual set out to grant MacArthur immunity, but collectively, every actor contributed to it. The overrule, in the end, was not issued in a single room. It emerged from the interaction of politics, press, and institutional caution. Military logic was not disproven. It was simply outweighed. By the time MacArthur stepped onto the beach, the system that should have constrained him had already decided, repeatedly, that it would not. The consequences of MacArthur's decision at Leyte unfolded not as a single catastrophe, but as a pattern that hardened over time. The landing itself succeeded. The Philippines would be retaken. No bullet struck the supreme commander on the beach. That absence of immediate punishment mattered more than any tactical detail. The system learned the wrong lesson. On the morning of October 20th, naval and ground commanders absorbed the cost of his presence without protest. Escort vessels shifted position. Air cover was reprioritized. Ground units extended security beyond what the situation required. These adjustments did not appear in communiques or press reports. They were internal compensations made to protect a man who had chosen exposure. From that moment forward, MacArthur's authority expanded in practice, not on paper. Subordinates recalibrated their behavior. They planned not only for enemy action, but for his unpredictability. Operations were shaped to accommodate his movements, his timing, his need for visibility. Risk calculations quietly changed. The safety margin for senior leadership narrowed because the senior leader rejected it. This had a cumulative effect on the Southwest Pacific Command environment. Decisions that should have been evaluated strictly through operational logic were filtered through a secondary question. How would this reflect on MacArthur? High-visibility actions received priority. Quiet efficiencies did not. The press became an operational factor, not an observer. Over time, this altered incentives. Officers learned that discretion did not protect careers, but alignment did. Those who enabled MacArthur's public narrative advanced. Those who questioned it stalled. This was not formal policy. It was behavioral adaptation. The chain of command adjusted itself to reality as it existed, not as doctrine described it. The diversion of resources at Leyte was small in isolation. The precedent was not. Each accommodation made the next one easier. Each unchallenged risk normalized the next. MacArthur's belief in his immunity was reinforced not by rhetoric, but by results. Nothing happened to him. Something happened to everyone else. Strategic coordination with other theaters suffered indirectly. Requests for resources were framed in terms of symbolic necessity. The liberation of the Philippines became inseparable from MacArthur's personal narrative, making dissent appear unpatriotic. Competing priorities had to justify themselves not only militarily, but politically. This environment strained inter-service relations. Naval leaders resented being compelled to support theatrics. Army officers resented the distortion of command norms. But resentment did not translate into resistance. The cost of confrontation was too high, and the outcome too predictable. The battlefield consequences were uneven but real. Units were exposed longer than necessary. Security was stretched to protect presence rather than position. Planning absorbed friction introduced by an unaccountable variable at the top. None of this lost the war. It did change how it was fought. MacArthur's continued visibility amplified his leverage. Each successful photograph, each headline, further insulated him. The public saw victory embodied in a single figure. That perception narrowed the space for institutional correction even further. By the time the Philippines campaign progressed inland, the distinction between operational command and personal myth was functionally gone. The most significant consequence was structural. Authority no longer flowed cleanly downward. It curved around one individual. The system adapted to protect him, and in doing so, weakened its own capacity to regulate behavior. Lady did not produce immediate disaster. It produced confirmation. MacArthur had taken a risk for spectacle and survived it without consequence. The system had absorbed the cost. That outcome validated his approach. From that point forward, the balance between military necessity and personal image tilted decisively. The consequences were not dramatic. They were persistent. They shaped decisions, incentives, and risks across the remainder of his command. The beach at Leyte was not remembered for what almost happened. It was remembered for what did not. And that absence of punishment became its most enduring effect. The post-war record removed any ambiguity about what had happened at Leyte and why it mattered. With the war over and the political constraints of 1944 no longer operative, the internal documentation became accessible, and the pattern that had protected MacArthur during the conflict was visible in full. Correspondence between the White House and senior military leadership confirmed what had been suspected at the time. Roosevelt had been aware of MacArthur's conduct in operational zones. He had been angered by it. He had discussed it privately with advisors and chiefs of staff. He had also decided, repeatedly, that no corrective action would be taken. The reason was consistent and explicit. MacArthur's popularity made him politically dangerous to confront. Admiral William Leahy's post-war recollections were blunt. He described a commander whose behavior would not have been tolerated from anyone else. He also described a president who understood the risks and accepted them as the price of domestic stability. Leahy did not frame this as admiration or condemnation. He framed it as management under constraint. Joint Chiefs memoranda from the period reinforced the same conclusion. MacArthur's insubordination was not disputed. His public manipulation of strategy debates was documented. Recommendations for formal reprimand existed. They were not acted upon. Each time, the decision was deferred upward. Each time, the answer was silence. MacArthur's own writings after the war were revealing in a different way. He did not deny his use of symbolism. He did not apologize for it. He treated it as an extension of command. In his account, morale and perception were weapons, and he had used them effectively. He did not acknowledge the institutional costs. He did not mention the diversions, the accommodations, or the strain his behavior imposed on the system around him. Later historical assessments converged on the same judgment. MacArthur's authority during the war had been sustained less by formal command structures than by a political environment that discouraged confrontation. He had not broken the system. He had exploited its reluctance to act. The Leyte landing, when revisited through this documentation, appeared not as an isolated indulgence, but as a representative example. It illustrated how operational norms were subordinated to narrative, and how that subordination was tolerated because correcting it carried unacceptable political risk. The post-war record also clarified the limits of this arrangement. When MacArthur later challenged civilian authority openly, after Roosevelt was gone and political conditions had changed, the insulation failed. The same behaviors that had been tolerated in wartime became unacceptable in peacetime. The system that had once protected him no longer needed to. That contrast mattered. It demonstrated that MacArthur's immunity had never been absolute. It had been conditional. It depended on context, on war, on popularity, and on a president willing to absorb the cost of restraint. Once those conditions disappeared, so did the protection. Historians did not need speculation to reach this conclusion. The evidence was written, archived, and acknowledged by the participants themselves. MacArthur had believed he was untouchable, and for a time, he was correct. But the record showed why. Not because the system approved of his behavior, but because it feared the consequences of stopping it. Leahy stood in that record as confirmation. It was the moment when personal narrative was allowed to override operational discipline without penalty. The fact that nothing happened afterward was not accidental. It was policy by omission. In hindsight, the post-war documents closed the case. The beach landing was not judged by its danger, but by its aftermath. The system had chosen accommodation over enforcement, and in doing so, had revealed its own limits. Those limits defined MacArthur's wartime command more clearly than any battlefield map ever could. The final record leaves no uncertainty. Douglas MacArthur was not protected by military necessity. He was protected by political calculation. His authority during the war did not rest on discipline or restraint, but on the fear of confronting him. At Leahy, he chose spectacle over procedure. He accepted operational risk not to achieve a military objective, but to reinforce a personal narrative. That choice did not cost him his command. It did not draw public reprimand. It did not trigger institutional correction. It was absorbed. That absorption was the verdict. The system around him evaluated the danger of his behavior and decided the danger of stopping him was greater. Presidents tolerated him. Chiefs of staff managed around him. Subordinates adjusted to him. Each accommodation reinforced the same conclusion. He could act without consequence as long as his popularity remained intact. This was not weakness on his part. It was calculation. He understood power as it actually functioned, not as it was described in manuals. He exploited that understanding consistently. He did not need to defy authority openly. He only needed to make enforcement too costly to attempt. His untouchability was therefore real, but conditional. It existed only within the political environment of wartime America. When that environment changed, the protection vanished. The same behaviors that had been tolerated became unacceptable once political fear receded. Leahy stands as the clearest expression of that dynamic. Not because of what happened on the beach, but because of what did not happen afterward. No reprimand. No correction. No consequence. That absence was the decision that mattered. MacArthur did not command because he was beyond error. He commanded because the system chose not to challenge him. His legend was not the result of invincibility. It was the product of accommodation. The case is closed. The record is complete. The outcome is settled. If you want more investigations like this, subscribe to the channel and leave your comment below.